Before we even start thinking about the civil rights movement and everything that happened during that time in the 1950s and the 1960s, we really need to think about what happened before that, to set the scene, to set the context. And hopefully, that way we'll be able to see the importance of the civil rights movement a lot more clearly. So this key question here that we've got right in front of us is what we're going to focus on for the first 2 or 3 lessons. What was life like in the United States of America for African Americans before the beginning of the civil rights movement, and why? During this video, you're probably going to have to pause occasionally in order to take notes and to take in what I'm saying. But hopefully this will give you enough background information to see or to begin to understand why the civil rights movement was necessary and what it stemmed from. So during the civil rights movement, this is what one side of America looked like. So prosperity, families were starting to look more middle class, essentially. Kind of like the homes that you live in today, where there are household appliances like televisions, entertainment, things like that. And everyone was starting to own their own car, which at the time was something quite new. It was an era of prosperity for America. So that's one side. But the other side was this. The other side of America was basically what we would term segregation. Segregation. If you look at the bottom photo, where there's a colored drink tap and a white drink tap, that pretty much summarizes the state of American society quite well. Now, it would be wrong for me to say that that was what the whole of American society was like, but in a lot of states in America, particularly those which we would deem the southern states, this is what life was like for African Americans. Discrimination, prejudice, and generally speaking, this idea that African Americans were inferior, which is not dissimilar to the kind of racial attitudes that the Nazis had when we were thinking about the Holocaust, when we were thinking about the life of Jews in Germany. Interesting connection there. Okay, so this is a society that African Americans lived in the 1950s. We talked about segregation, but the thing about segregation was it was completely legal. It was completely legal because of these things called Jim Crow laws, which were discriminatory and racist laws that enforced segregation in public places and facilities. Just think about the social effect of that for a second. So not only was there legal discrimination, but there was also a lot of violence. For example, lynching, which I won't go into with much detail because it's quite disgusting. But a lot of lynchings happened during this time. And also the prominence of groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, which was actually formed after the Civil War in the late 1800s, but carried on in its prominence and in its membership and popularity through to the 1950s and 60s. So this is a brief timeline of different events that we're going to look at. We will go into that in a bit more detail in a second. So in year 9, you probably looked at a bit at slavery, so you probably have some background. I'm pretty sure you guys talked about William Wilberforce and what happened in England and etc. And you probably should know that in America, when it was settled, and in the early 1600s, slavery was a huge part of American society. Now, just briefly, slaves were considered property, they had no citizenship rights, and were considered morally, racially inferior. Slaves were mostly prominent in what we would call the southern states, and this was because of the importance of cotton farming. Cotton farming was a huge part of the southern economy. Basically, without cotton farming, the South probably would have collapsed economically. So owning slaves was really important because the slaves did all the work. Owning slaves was also a way of life for some of the richer families because it showed status and wealth. It would be incorrect for me to say that everyone in the South had slaves, because they didn't. But generally speaking, slaves were considered at the bottom of the social hierarchy, if not even on it. So when we talk about the South, I'm talking about these states in green: Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. In these states, this kind of attitude towards slaves was pretty common. So I'll give you a second to read that. So as you can see, it wasn't just this idea of slaves being necessary for the economy, but this idea that slavery actually improved the lives of those who were enslaved, which is bizarre for us now, but if we consider the racial views of people back then, not that surprising. Okay, so then the Civil War happened in 1861 to 1865, and basically this was the southern states, which called themselves the Confederacy, against the Union, which was pretty much every other state in the North. The Confederacy wanted to break away from the other states and form their own government because of this idea of states' rights. One of the big questions that was debated, but also fought over during the Civil War, was, did states have the right to own slaves? And the South were definitely fighting for that right. So in 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which announced that anyone who was a slave should be considered free. Emancipation basically means to set free. After the Civil War ended, and luckily the North won, the government had to find a way to bring together white Southerners, white racist Southerners who had lived in a slavery-filled society for pretty much all of their lives. They had to bring those people together with newly freed African Americans, and they also had to make sure that the freedom that African Americans had, or now had, would be secure. Now, during Reconstruction, 3 important amendments were passed which changed the Constitution. So the Constitution, you might know, is basically the highest law of the land. There were 3 amendments that were really important. The first, or I should say the 13th, outlawed slavery for good. The 14th gave African Americans the right to citizenship. And the 15th gave adult African American men the right to vote. So you're going to need to know those 3 amendments because they're crucial to understanding the Constitution in this period of time. Unfortunately, Reconstruction failed. One of the reasons was because Abraham Lincoln was assassinated a few months after the war had finished, which meant that he couldn't really spearhead what he wanted to do. Basically, what happened in the end was that Southern governments who opposed racial equality were now able to impose laws that restricted the rights of African Americans, and they did. Skip that. And these laws were called Jim Crow laws. So in 1896, a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson established that separating the races, which was clearly not the original goal of Reconstruction, separating the races was not against the Constitution as long as conditions were quote-unquote equal, which obviously in reality they weren't. They were completely unequal. Every facility that the African Americans had was inferior to that of the whites. Basically, this court case, because it was decided by the highest court of the land, gave state governments across America a legal right to segregate the societies through a series of laws called Jim Crow laws. And this is a picture of Jim Crow. Okay, so the Jim Crow laws, that term, is more of a colloquial term, but they were known as Jim Crow laws because of this cartoon character here. And Jim Crow laws did not even begin to change until 1955. So a really long time, about 60 years really. 60 years of solid, segregated societies. So, to summarize, Slavery, 1619, introduced blacks as slaves and created the attitude that blacks were not citizens and had no rights. And that's really important to understand, that this whole idea of separating the races, even though it was something that was written into law, really came from the attitudes of those who pushed for it. And these attitudes were challenged greatly during the Civil Rights Movement, but they were also the force that opposed the Civil Rights Movement later on. So, Civil War in 1861 to 65, basically the Emancipation Proclamation during the war freed the slaves. Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, the amendments were made to the Constitution, but it failed ultimately due to politics in the White House, which meant that state governments were now able to impose laws that, again, restricted the rights of African Americans. And this was pretty much written into law during Plessy versus, or as a result of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, when the Supreme Court decision made Jim Crow laws legal and created this legal doctrine, so to speak, of separate but equal, which it wasn't. So there you have the background to the Civil Rights Movement, and hopefully when we start looking at it in a bit more depth, you can make some connections to this video and to this PowerPoint, which is on the portal.